On Primetime Politics, conflicting conclusions.
I was a target.
The NDP leader sounds an alarm after reading the unredacted NSICOP report, saying there are some MPs who have worked against Canadian interests. But is his tone too hot? That's what the Green Party leader is saying, and coming up, our journalists will give us their take on this divided judgment. Two opposition leaders coming up with two very different conclusions on foreign interference. And the crisis of food. World Vision appeals to the G7, asking leaders to address the global food crisis. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Both the NDP and Green Party leaders have now read the unredacted report from NSICOP. But as we told you yesterday, their conclusions are very different. One expressing relief, the other alarm.
Having read the full, unredacted National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report, for myself, I can say, I have no worries about anyone in the House of Commons.
I am more alarmed today than I was yesterday after having read the report. What is clear to me is that Justin Trudeau knew and didn't act, and Pierre Poilievre doesn't even want to know.
Well, to talk about this disconnect, we're now joined by Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, Chris Nardi, Parliamentary Reporter for the National Post, and Kirsty Kirkup, Parliamentary Reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hello to the three of you.
Hello. Hello.
You know, I do want to talk about this disconnect, although I will make one observation, because listening to Elizabeth May earlier in the week, it seemed that she was very much relying and leaning in on the unredacted report, where Jagmeet Singh seemed to be referencing both the redacted and unredacted reports. I don't know if that helps explain the disconnect, but Tonda, what do you make of this, opposite messaging that we're getting from the two different leaders?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question in Ottawa right now, because none of us have seen this, the classified version of this report that, presented these two opposing views. I mean, imagine an alternative reality where, they actually did agree. They came out of reading that thing and thought, I have a constructive way forward now on how to deal with this, but we didn't get that. I think that many Canadians would be wondering what on earth is going on? What are we to take from it? Here we have a parliamentary committee of politicians who understand the rules around nominations and the caveats that they were exposed, or the intelligence with caveats that they did or didn't see. We don't know. And they can't yet agree on a way that politicians who understand all this can go forward, not in a partisan way, but in a way that reinforces both Canada's answer and to the challenge of foreign interference and reinforces Canadians' confidence in democracy. I think that all these political leaders have failed Canadians this week and last. In the first instance, for failing to realize what an uproar would be created over it. But in the second instance, now from the disagreement over what it means, now we also are not hearing and talking about, the diaspora groups that are affected greatly by foreign interference. And we're not talking about how some of the politicians in ethnic groups now are being made to feel suspect by these unverified allegations. And let's face it, like, foreign interference involves politicians meeting with groups and whether or not hostile actors are trying to influence them. But it's not just ethnic politicians, politicians from diaspora groups that are meeting them. White politicians are too, but now everyone is just wondering what the hell is going on. So I feel it's an utter failure in leadership on our political leaders this week.
Yeah, as you say, the great debate right now in Ottawa. Chris, what do you make of this disconnect?
Well, it's the equivalent of like me banging my head on this table, because yeah, absolutely.
Zoom in, please.
Yeah, because we are reporting on substance that we don't know.
Yeah.
And information, like when you have a void, it's always filled with speculation. If you don't have information, you fill it with speculation. I would somewhat disagree with you. I'm not sure if NSICOP didn't know what they were doing when they put it in there, though. I do agree that I don't know if they expected that particular portion, the MPs wittingly, unwittingly, or semi-wittingly, blowing up the way that it has. But that was the new fundamental information that we didn't have. Yeah. But I think the part of the difference between Mr. Singh and Ms. May's interpretation, I think, is also slightly personal in that Jagmeet Singh really emphasized how he is personally, in fact, impacted by foreign interference. He himself was the target of it. And I do believe, without knowing what he saw and how it's so dramatically different from Ms. May, he's looking at it with a very different lens. That is, that he will automatically be more concerned because he's actually felt it and he's seen it in his own community. So I think that would explain a little bit of the difference. But ultimately, because we have this incredible void and there doesn't appear to be a quick way for them to release this information publicly in a way that protects our national security, that void's just going to keep being filled with speculation, and it hurts, as Tonda was saying, more than it cures.
I was just to that point, though. I think even it was striking that the chairman of the committee came forward and said, expressed bafflement that we were all focused on this. So he said they did not contemplate that. They did not contemplate the fallout or how the question of who's involved should be dealt with.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because Elizabeth May, when she was talking, had her press conference, she said she understood what was happening in the media. But the truth is, and you alluded to this, nature abhors a vacuum, and you're trying to find the answers to connect the pieces for Canadians. What do you make of this disconnect, Kirsty?
I agree with what Chris said. I think it is significant that Jagmeet Singh, as a leader, is saying that he was named as a target in the report. He didn't offer details when he was asked about what that meant. But again, I think if your name appears in a report like that, I think he has, of course, faced threats because of who he is, being a Sikh leader as well, and given everything that has taken place with respect to India and the allegations of foreign interference as they relate to specifically the actions of India in Canada. I think that there's also this great debate about the list of names, right? So Elizabeth May, kind of in a confusing way. Sometimes you have to really nail it down with Elizabeth May about what she is saying in a press conference. And she talked about there not being a secret list of names of those who have been disloyal to Canada. Then she did, of course, mention that there were MPs that were named in the report. She went on to say that, some of them might actually have been conspiring with foreign actors, but, that she's not concerned. And then you have Jagmeet Singh coming out and using, I think the word of the press conference was the word traitor. When you say that was the headline for everyone, when he dropped the traitor word, that was the moment. And I was in that scrum on Parliament Hill. It was pretty rough and tumble. People were trying to, ask him what he meant in a number of instances. But when he was specifically asked by one of our colleagues on the Hill if this, if individuals in the report could be seen as traitors, and he said, yes, they are indeed traitors to Canada. I think that was the moment where now you have Elizabeth May coming out today in a radio interview saying, that she thinks that language is too much, that it's too hot, I think is the quote. So, I don't know where Canadians are left with all of this, frankly. I think there's a lot of confusion.
Yeah, a lot of confusion. And one of the big questions, too, beyond saying the traitor, what resonated for me with Elizabeth May was during her news conference, she did say that, there is a past MP that should be investigated, which seemed to give the okay or the clearance for everybody else who's currently sitting in the House of Commons. However, when Jagmeet Singh was giving his news conference, he said MPs, as if implying they are still sitting in the House of Commons. And
there was no confusion around what he was saying in that respect. He was leading us all to believe that there are current sitting MPs, and he actually at one point said some of this is criminal, some of it illegal, all of it unethical. So there was no doubt about the facts of what he says he read. Where there's doubt and confusion is that he's alarmed and she said she wasn't.
She's relieved, vastly relieved.
Relieved, and felt very safe to be in the House of Commons, right? Yeah. So, because of course there was this looking over your shoulder in the first week when NSICOP actually released this report. You were going to say?
I was just going to say that I think this report has been circulating for a couple of months in the senior levels of government in terms of dealing with what should and would be redacted in it. And at no point, I'm curious about this, at no point, though, did it raise their alarm bells such that they felt that they needed a plan of action to roll out the moment that report dropped. So what does that tell us? What are we supposed to understand? Are we supposed to understand that they don't take it seriously? Or are we supposed to understand that the actual unredacted report doesn't portray as an alarming a picture as some of us have felt maybe is in there? But without knowing, we're all just blind.
Well, to paraphrase Jagmeet Singh, he says the Prime Minister is accepting the fact that some foreign interference is acceptable. You want to comment on that?
I would say that Rubicon was crossed a while ago when there was a fair amount of proven foreign interference that we saw nothing had happened. It came up in the Hogue report. I don't know if I'm accusing liberals necessarily of turning a blind eye to it, but there's a fair amount of evidence that they've known about the Don Valley North nomination race in 2019, I think, is a good example, too, of them saying, it could be fine. And so, honestly, it's just very frustrating to look at how the situation is evolving. There's been a ton of this information, as Tonda said, circulating amongst the highest rungs of government because they get these reports well before we do to redact them. They know what the issues are. And for the most part, what you get the sense is that Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc has been sent out to bury these things. That's what he's very good at. He's get put into a portfolio so that we shut up about the portfolio. He tries to fix it internally, but we don't talk about it. And I find it's very telling that even for an experienced fixer and issue barrier like Dominic LeBlanc, that the Liberals have completely lost the message and their grip on this issue, that even he can't bury it, speaks to how woefully unprepared and how much they underestimated the impact that this would have, the concerns that it would raise, and again, the vacuum that we face right now and how everyone's going to try to fill it with some form of information or not. They were not ready for it. I don't know why they weren't ready for it. And they really have to start figuring this out, especially as the Hogue inquiry goes into its second phase of work.
Yeah, well, I will say, I've done a number of interviews with different security analysts who say at the end of the day, this Trudeau government is not concerned enough about security. That might be what we're seeing here. We'll see. Although, we talk about the Prime Minister, but when Jagmeet Singh was up there, he was also criticizing the Conservative leader. In fact, he says Pierre Poilievre's refusal to sign the necessary documents to see the unredacted report disqualifies him from ever being Prime Minister. What type of pressure does Pierre Poilievre now face as a result of these two opposition leaders, neither of whom are leaders of the opposition, have already seen the unredacted report?
I think there is political pressure for the Conservative leader. The fact that he is standing alone as the one leader who, the bloc leader has yet to do his briefing. And he actually issued a statement after Jagmeet Singh's press conference yesterday, kind of throwing his hands up, really kind of saying, like, what are we going to do with these leaders who have two very different interpretations of the report? But for Pierre Poilievre, there is that central question. If only we could, ask that question in a press conference. We don't have that opportunity, to be clear. The Conservatives, through statements from, the Office of the Official Opposition, have made it clear that they don't really see the value in Pierre Poilievre going in and getting this briefing, that he's not going to be able to say that much more than what he can say based on the redacted report. And frankly, I think Jagmeet Singh's press conference maybe, kind of feeds into that argument, right? Because there were certain ways in which Jagmeet went beyond, again, including talking about himself being personally targeted. But he had, how much more has he been able to say, Jagmeet Singh, publicly than he was able to say before he saw the redacted report? So Pierre Poilievre is in that unique position of not getting briefed. Clearly, this is for political reasons. I think he's being frank about that. Yeah,
well, although Jagmeet Singh makes the argument, it's choosing politics over national security. So I do wonder about this. Does it create a problem for Pierre Poilievre to have not seen the documents yet?
Look, I think they've made a calculation, a political calculation, that there's a certain segment of chattering classes that care about this, but the vast majority of Canadians are going to cast a vote based on other issues, the bread and butter issues that he always argues. So they've made a calculation. It's not going to help them to dive down there, and that their time is better spent on other issues instead of, you've seen them switch focus. Like early on, when foreign interference broke as a news story, they were on it. But they've very quickly since then pivoted away from it. And he asked one question last week when the first report came out, when the report first came out, and I think that he may be, how do we know? Let's all look into our crystal ball. He may be underestimating, however, that now that he's in the running to be Prime Minister, and the polls show that he could very well hold that chair, that Canadians now expect that they'll want someone who will take the question of national security seriously. And that's where there's a risk for him in these political calculations. I think it could undermine a little bit of the prime ministerial sort of persona that people would like to see in him. It's a risk.
Yeah. And I'd argue also he's in this kind of weird situation too now, where two things. It takes a while to get the security clearance, even for party leaders. There's a certain, so if he applies for it now, there's a world in which he only gets it at a time when we're not talking about this report as much. It's just kind of this weird duality where they have to do a certain amount of background checks, and that can take time depending on the person. But beyond that, I know Conservatives have whispered that they don't want to feel like they're bound by the Security of Information Act, which basically protects national security information, and that by kind of signing into it, by getting this clearance, it precludes him from acting. I'm of two minds of that, because how can he act if he doesn't know? So either way, he's not acting. I do think that he's made that decision politically, and people raise speculation that he couldn't pass it. I don't necessarily ascribe to that description at all. But ultimately, it's true that you kind of want a leader who wants to get more information and then work to find a way to, like François Blanchet of the Bloc said, I don't have to reveal this information, but I can certainly not sign a certain MP's nomination letters if I don't think that they're trustworthy. There are ways to act on the intelligence without revealing that it's intelligence related. It might not be immediate, it might not be harsh, and it might not be as public as us reporters want to know. But there are things that you can do with that knowledge, and I do find that the Conservatives are kind of trying to forget that or hide that aspect of it by saying, oh, well, we're bound by the Security of Information Act if we get this clearance, and so we just won't.
Okay, well, we have one more week. It's in the sitting week. We'll see how this plays out. But for now, Tonda, Chris, and Kirsty, thank you very much. NSA cop? NSI cop? Okay, the debate continues. We'll see you next week. Thank you. As the G7 came together in southern Italy this week, World Vision issued an urgent plea asking international leaders to address the global food crisis and sharing the findings of a new survey that says refugees and vulnerable families are receiving just a fraction of their monthly required food intake or are being cut from aid distributions altogether. This is leading apparently to a drastic increase in child marriage, child trafficking, and child labor. Now, that said, the G7 is adopting something that's been called the Apulia Food Systems Initiative. And to talk about all of this, we're now joined by David Munkley. He is with World Vision, has seen the crisis play out in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and joins us right now in Goma. David, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, I want to begin our conversation here with the issue of rations, because your organization, World Vision, it says they have been cut. But why? Is this because richer countries are giving less? Has demand increased? What's happened here?
It's a bit of both, really. What we found is that the increase has raised very much in the DRC. In the last 2 years, the number of displaced people has grown exponentially. It's now in the millions. I believe overall it's about 7 million people now displaced in the DRC, much of whom are in Eastern DRC, where we work and do a lot of our operations. And then it's also, it's a matter of donor fatigue. It's prioritization. It's sometimes looking away from really maybe a longer term conflict. But in these longer term conflicts, we need these rations. It's absolutely essential. And what we're seeing here is with the ration cuts, it's creating much more difficult terms for families that are displaced, and certainly children that are displaced throughout Eastern DRC.
Okay, dig into that if you don't mind, David. When rations are actually cut, what does that mean for families in need of food? Do they eat less? Do they eat less frequently? How does that translate onto the ground?
Yes, there's a lot of knock-on effects, of course. They eat less frequently, there's less good food, you have to sell household assets. Children would then have to start working. There's concerns around sexual abuse and exploitation of again, boys and girls. Mortality rates will go up. Children will fall sick more easily from preventable diseases, malaria, cholera, waterborne diseases, any number of things. It creates greater criminality in the areas around these displaced camps, so people are really at risk of greater violence. So there's so many different ways in which reducing the cuts impacts negatively on children and families, health, water and sanitation. The list is very long, but it's very negative.
Can you connect the dots a bit more here, David? Because you mentioned child exploitation, child abuse. How is that tied to food rationing?
Well, when families don't have enough to eat, they need to figure out, how are we going to get food? Maybe we're sending our children out to do small tasks or to do work in the communities, or maybe they even have to go into the brush to collect firewood. We found that in many of these cases, those people that are going out and collecting firewood, or those people going into difficult positions, they're being exploited. There's armed groups on the peripheries of these camps. There's criminal gangs. And again, with greater desperation, people take really desperate measures. And sometimes that involves even selling their bodies, greater prostitution. So it really is a parlous state of affairs for the children in these camps.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that part of the reason why World Vision has been signaling the issue is because of the meeting of the G7 this week. We saw G7 leaders essentially announcing the Apulia Food Systems Initiative, and that is their attempt at addressing structural barriers to food security and nutrition. What impact do you think that initiative will actually have?
That remains to be seen. I think one of the concerns is that it's not just East DRC, it's also Afghanistan, Somalia, I know in Ukraine. There are multiple conflict areas that require, again, this front level support in terms of food rations. For Eastern DRC, the number keeps rising. So even with this initiative, it remains to be seen if it's going to really be felt on the ground. We're glad to hear that there is a greater prioritization, again, to ensure that the most needy and vulnerable children and families will have greater support. But we have to see how this is going to go.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what more you'd like to see from countries like Canada. As I said, this is one G7 initiative, but this is a meeting of the industrialized democratic nations. Beyond that, what do you want to see from countries like Canada?
I think it's to continue to prioritize these conflict situations. I think Canada has the role of being a global thought leader. We have tremendous respect and goodwill around the world. And I think that comes with responsibility. And part of those responsibilities is not only to increase or to continue on with these necessary and life-saving donations and support, but it's also to, in these meetings in G7 or in other global governance affairs, to really lend our voice to the most vulnerable children and families, because it's not going away. And in Eastern DRC, we're seeing the problem is still getting worse. Just in the past couple of months, there's been hundreds of thousands of more people displaced from their homes. So that's something we'd like Canada to lend its voice to and continue to work alongside leading NGOs such as World Vision to find longer-term solutions.
Mm-hmm. You yourself are Canadian. You live right now in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but you yourself are Canadian. You know very well that Canadians are facing their own struggles here at home. Is it hard to get the message out when domestic affairs often drowns out the concerns being expressed by countries outside of this?
It's always difficult to get the message out. I understand that. Something you hear often is charity starts at home. Agreed. But again, I think in this world, Canada being what it is again, a global leader, a thought leader, somebody who pushes these vital things forward. We need to continue to just push the key messaging and really connect the dots as to why this is important, why this is going to ultimately support greater peace and development in Eastern DRC, and you can say worldwide with several other countries. And these are necessary things to ensure, again, the safety and well-being of vulnerable children in Eastern DRC.
David Munkley, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time.
Much appreciated. Thanks.
Well, time now for a look at what happened in politics this week.
Having read the full, unredacted National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report, for myself, I can say, I have no worries about anyone in the House of Commons.
Green Party leader Elizabeth May spoke to reporters on Tuesday. May, the first opposition leader to read the unredacted NSICOP report. She says she was vastly relieved after reading it. May says the report did not contain a list of MPs who have demonstrated disloyalty to Canada, but there are clearly threats to Canadian democracy from foreign governments. As a result, May is calling for the report's recommendations to be implemented. But later in the week, the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh spoke in stark contrast to Elizabeth May after he read the unredacted NSICOP report.
I am not relieved after reading this report. I am more concerned today than I was yesterday. This government has received multiple repeated warnings and recommendations and has not acted. Today, Canada is vulnerable to foreign interference, and this weakens our democracy and the confidence of Canadians.
Singh repeated information from the report, saying some parliamentarians were semi-witting or witting participants in foreign efforts to interfere in Canadian politics. He also called the alleged actions, quote, deeply unethical and contrary to the oaths and affirmations parliamentarians take to conduct themselves in the best interest of Canada. Also this week, the House voted to approve the Liberal government's plan to expand the capital gains inclusion rate, but Conservative MPs voted against the measure, their leader Pierre Poilievre calling it a job-killing tax.
My position is that a job-killing tax on healthcare, homes, farms, and small businesses is the last thing we need in this cost of living crisis the Prime Minister has caused.
Announced in the spring budget, the change will expand the inclusion rate to 66.7% for individuals who realize over $250,000 in capital gains annually. The measure is set to take effect June the 25th. And finally, the federal government released its own data on the impact of the carbon tax. According to their analysis, the carbon tax would lower Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by over 12% by 2030. But the data also shows Canada's GDP could be hurt to the tune of $25 billion by that same year. The release comes after the PBO said the government would not allow his office to share the data in its reports. And that is Primetime Politics for today. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back next week. Until then, have a great weekend.